Hi, and welcome to the #1 Comics Show, where we talk about the great #1 issues and first appearances of various comics and comic book characters. And this is the first one I'm doing with you, Matt. I've done a couple of these solo, and again, it kind of grew out of, over the summer, I wanted to do this thing of like, read a bunch of #1s. Be like, okay, first Batman, or, you know, this or that. Some of them, like, I've read before, but it's kind of cool to just kind of like, you know, focus on that. And some of them I'd never read before. Like, I never read Hawkman like the first Hawkman comic before, which was in Flash Comics #1. Never read that before. So that was kind of cool. Like, it's kind of cool, like, seeing where these things start. I thought this would be a good one for us to do together, because I know you're like way into G.I. Joe. So
hell yeah.
Yeah, we got like the first, you know, G.I. Joe #1. I'm pretty sure this, like, that this was the first one. This was like, it came out in like a Treasury edition first, and then it was reprinted a bunch of times in sort of this like smaller version.
You've showed me the big Treasury one before that you had.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's kind of the definitive way to read it. I mean, it's a great story, and it looks good at that smaller size too, but this is like, you can really kind of savor it, you know.
You gave me this a few years ago.
Yeah, because IDW sent me those as kind of, you know, I was on like the sort of comp list for, you know, for Transformers versus G.I. Joe, but I already had like all the single issues for this volume. So yeah, I gave that.
It was amazing. I read through it a few years ago. Haven't read it since, so I was like, I'm very excited when you suggested this.
So you never read this like issue 1 before you got that? Like,
no,
you never read it as a kid or anything?
Like, somehow G.I. Joe comics found their way into my possessions, like from maybe my cousins.
Mm-hmm.
But I was never like, I never would read them in order.
Yeah.
Or like...
And it really benefits from being read in order. Like, I never had any G.I. Joe comics when I was a kid. I watched the show from the cartoon from the first episode. I loved it. I had a bunch of the toys. I was like very invested in G.I. Joe, but I never got into the comic. It wasn't until I was like an adult that like I started hearing from other people who were like, who grew up with the comic. Like, no, that's a great comic. Because I had just assumed it was just more of the same from the show. And I did reach a point, like, I outgrew the G.I. Joe cartoon. And you can sort of understand why it has a lot of those, like, it's a great cartoon, and I can look back on it now and see all the virtues. But as a kid at the time, it has like those restrictions of sort of Saturday morning TV or whatever, you know, that kind. But discovering the comic, it's like the comic has none of that. Like, the comic takes no prisoners. It's hardcore. It takes no prisoners. They're not shooting flashing lights at each other. They're shooting real bullets.
I remember it when I was little, watching the G.I. Joe cartoon and like being upset that there was lasers in it.
Yeah, and those were all my complaints, was that you know, as a kid, were that kind of like, okay, yeah, you just have these like harmless they're not if they were lasers, that would be one thing, but they're just harmless flashing lights, because nobody seems to like take any damage from them. And then also, like, if somebody's plane blows up, the parachute always came out. Like, nobody ever died, but like people die in, you know, the G.I. Joe comic. Like, if I was you know, as a kid, if I were reading the G.I. Joe comics, I would have never grown out of G.I. Joe. You know what I mean? Like,
no, like I had G.I. Joe comics, but like, I don't know if I didn't like process them or like really even paid attention to them.
Well, that's another thing. Like, when I worked on Transformers versus G.I. Joe, I read all of them. Like, I was just like buying whatever ones I could get my hands on and reading them and you know, reading them very thoroughly. And yeah, if you read them in order from issue 1 all the way through, even to like the present day, because like there was like an interruption of where it wasn't being published, and then like IDW brings in Larry Hama to kind of pick up where he left off in the original series, and then that ended, you know, like a year or two ago, and then now they're starting it back up again. But
that's awesome.
It's been this uninterrupted thing, and it's just like it's amazing. Like, especially these Marvel issues. And in adulthood, I had sort of, you know, heard good things about it and acquired an issue here and there. And other than, there's like the famous Silent issue, and that one was like, oh yeah, this is really good. But then the other issues I'd read, I was kind of like, yeah, this is pretty good, this is all right, or whatever. But if you read it in order, it's like, oh, this is amazing. Like, it unfolds at this very like natural rate, and like characters are introduced and storylines are introduced and kind of weave in and out and stuff. It's pretty good.
Dude, like, it felt like like the first issue, it feels like a 70s or 80s like thriller or action, like a legit like an action movie.
Yeah, and the structure of it, like, it feels like this could be replicated. That superhero comics could learn lessons from this, like the way it's structured, because it's like, okay, we got this mission. The scientist's been kidnapped. She's got these like secrets that she's got, and she's also she's become like kind of an embarrassment to like the American government because she's kind of like a whistleblower or something.
Yeah.
And so then the G.I. Joe team have kind of ambivalent feelings about her as a whistleblower, but she's been kidnapped by the bad guys, so they're going to rescue her. But like all of these characters who are like, sort of Saturday morning cartoon characters when you turn on the TV, in this comic, there's a couple of them at various points who are like, well, why don't we just let them kill her? That would actually solve a bunch of our problems if she, and then somebody will be like, well, we can't, because then we'd be no better than they are. It's like, okay.
They talk about like bombing the island or something, and I was like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and they're like, we can't, have that kind of body count and stuff. So yeah, just acknowledging that kind of like sort of gallows humor and like cutthroat attitude. It's pretty cool.
It's got the action of like putting a team together.
Yes.
Action movie aspect, but also like the part with like the kidnapping the scientist. It could be like a Warren Beatty like Parallax View, like Alan Palooka like thriller.
Yeah, it's very grown up. Like it's kind of weird to me because it feels like more grown up than like a Marvel comic of this era, but it's like based on a toy. Like it's a toy tie-in. So it's interesting to me that they're like, oh, for this toy tie-in, we need to go more sophisticated, not like less sophisticated, which is not how like a toy tie-in will be treated like a couple years down the line, at Marvel or whatever, when they create like the Star Comics line and stuff like that. And so just really like, because as a kid, I felt like, He-Man didn't respect my intelligence, and I felt like to a certain degree, G.I. Joe didn't respect my intelligence, but this like
feels like it also tickles my soul because it's like high art juxtaposed up against like the toys.
Right, yeah, the toys. And you got Larry Hama is writing it, and then Herb Trimpe is drawing it. And so those are like the two like, founding fathers of G.I. Joe. Like they were both there like, from the beginning and for a really long time. Trimpe draws like, some of the earliest issues, and then he even like writes a couple of the early issues, and then like later on other artists come in and he kind of pops in and out here and there, and occasionally will, write an issue here and there, but Hama is largely like the writer all the way through. And then G.I. Joe kind of splits into two series. You have G.I. Joe and then G.I. Joe Special Missions. So G.I. Joe kind of like continues these stories, and then G.I. Joe Special Missions, Herb Trimpe draws it and gets to sort of focus on, instead of like an ongoing soap opera, gets to do these kind of cool like done in one kind of action stories.
The scene on the train here, this is now my number one favorite hiding a gun in a camera scene.
Yes. Yeah, because like the gun, they're holding these cameras and then the gun like pops out. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
2 is True Lies and 3 is The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner.
Like war comics were kind of their own little specific subgenre that was never like hugely popular or whatever. So this is kind of like, it's war comics, but like, kind of like pretty sweet, like kind of with a tiny bit of like superhero kind of stuff. And like the flamboyant sort of superhero G.I. Joe will come later, like, and will come little by little, and then eventually like, kind of like explode. But you get a little, so like, you got all these sort of like dressed in green G.I. Joes with like tiny variations in their uniforms. And then there's like a couple standout characters. Snake Eyes is there, but he hasn't like taken over the book yet. But already you're kind of like, ooh, who's that? Who's that guy?
And then Super Steelers in the 70s. Yeah, the rub off.
Yeah, the Steeler, the sort of acknowledging the dominance of the Steelers, and he's from Pittsburgh.
And in Transformers vs. G.I. Joe, his Pittsburghese that you gave him, I can't fucking get him.
Because to me, it's like, what are you doing? Like, if you have a guy called Steeler from Pittsburgh and he's not, saying yins or talking about an Isley's chip chop ham sandwich.
Oh my God, it's a monster.
Yeah, ham barbecue and stuff. And again, like thinking about the influences coming into this comic, it's like we got like James Bond, because there's a lot of James, like, you know, there's Stalker riding around on his jetpack, kind of like, you know, From Russia with Love, or whatever that that James Bond was, where he starts off on like a jetpack. And this, the whole heist of how they kidnap her is kind of like, they have like a balloon ready to go and stuff. It's very James Bond.
I was scared the balloon was going to get caught in the rotor.
They introduce General Flag, and again, like reading through those old G.I. Joe comics, it blew my mind because like I knew about the USS General Flag, the toy. I didn't know there was an actual General Flag character, and you get to meet him. He's got the shades on, and like this image where he shows up for the first time. That was like when I saw him in the comic when I'm doing my research for Transformers vs. G.I. Joe. I'm like, you know what? That's a pretty cool look, but you just tilt that hat a little bit, you know.
The USS Flag G.I. Joe's toy is like a Total Recall like legend.
Yeah.
We need to somehow get our hands on these.
Yeah, send them to the P.O. box. The P.O. box is like jammed with
the USS Flag.
And then they're like putting the team together, and there's like in the cartoon, I think in the cartoon there was like a General Flag maybe. And I think it was like this. He looked like this guy. Like he looked like, this is General Iron Butt Austin. And so the General Flag in the cartoon looked like him, and there wasn't like the sort of sunglasses General Flag that. And yeah, in the comic, in Transformers vs. G.I. Joe,
so good.
I said that General Iron Butt Austin was like the opposite number of Destro, because Destro has like an iron face and he has an iron butt. So they're like opposites. Reading this, like I'm enjoying this thing as a comic, but it's also kind of like memory lane for me of remembering like reading this in preparation for Transformers vs. G.I. Joe, and then seeing all the panels where it's like, oh, I took that like the first page, I'm like, oh, I took that, but then set it on Cybertron, or, you know, Clutch is driving him in the car, and again, a lot of banter, and like a good banter. Like there's like funny lines in this that you know everybody's hitting.
Love seeing the vehicles.
Yeah, and they enter the motor pool, and then he's like, we must be the only motor pool in the world with a hydraulic lift that goes down. So this is like another influence. Like you got this sort of James Bond scene with like the training, which I love. I love this kind of stuff. And it looks really great in the oversized, like in the Treasury edition, you know, because there's a lot of space between them, which is kind of cool. But this thing of, so they have like the G.I. Joe base, which is underground, you know, the pit, but it's underneath the like army motor pool, you know, where they would like park the Jeeps and the tanks and like fuel them up and tune them up and stuff. And so that's the secret thing. And it's like kind of funny because it's like their cover, it's like, you know, you got this cover of like a barber shop, but then underneath there's this base. But for this, it's like, oh, the cover is, we got an army base. But then under the army base it's like a more of an army base. Yeah.
They call it the base. B.A.
Yeah. And then they have this hologram of like the island. Like other people did eventually pick up on the cues of these G.I. Joe comics and incorporate it into their superhero comics. You started to get that. You got a little bit in like the early 90s and stuff with some of like the pre-Image stuff and the Image things of like turning, you know, Rob Liefeld or whatever, turning X Factor into sort of like this like militarized task force or whatever, and having missions and stuff. But in like the late 90s and early 2000s, you really started getting these things like the Authority or whatever, where like it would be superheroes, but then they'd get like a mission like this, where like the lay of the land and the parameters are all kind of like set out in the beginning, and then they execute the mission. And then sometimes they'd put in like Tom Cruise Mission Impossible twist, where like everything goes wrong, you know, like a foobar, and like then like all the characters get killed off or something.
Every issue, like I love, and we talk about Mission Impossible or like the Tom Cruise one, like they can go anywhere in the world, like it's, so you get a cool like different setting every time.
Yeah, those first like bunch of G.I. Joe issues are so fun, and I really do love this like kind of green G.I. Joe, where like it's just like these interchangeable guys dressed in green with a couple of stars, and then little by little the stars, like the green guys go out and the stars go in, and it gets like more kind of visually interesting.
Like rock and roll's outfit. Yeah,
rock and roll. But I like this era, and this is like I remember as a kid playing the G.I. Joe board game, and it was like this era where it's like I watched the cartoon, but now I'm playing this board game. I don't know who any of these people are in the board game, you know? Like where's Duke? When does Duke show up in this board game, you know?
I like we got into the G.I. Joes when they were like, you know, each character was in their classic outfits. But then when I would like see pictures of like the, you know how like you get the little pamphlet with the toys.
Yeah, and there's in this there is like a version of that sort of pamphlet is in this comic. Yeah,
and I saw them all green. I'm like, whoa! I'm like, sucks to be that era. Like I was like,
right. Feel bad for the kids.
Feel bad for the kids from that.
Yeah,
that's what I said.
Exactly. Yeah, but that was like General Hawk, or he's Colonel Hawk here. He's like the leader. He's like the main guy. He's Duke before Duke. Like he's the main. But like in order to get his toy, you couldn't just go in the store and say, "Oh, I want the General Hawk toy." You'd have to buy the tank. I think you'd buy the tank, and then he came with the tank.
Oh.
So that was the only way you could get the main guy. You know,
dude, a toy with a figure gets me every time. Mm-hmm. It's like the best thing. Like you can't beat it. They got the Baroness.
The Baroness, and yeah, that's another one where it's like seeing the influences come in. There's like a Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of influence here. And even some of the panels seem like they're kind of like modeled after some panels from there. And there's also like Nick Fury's Howling Commandos. And there's kind of like a thing of like that prior to this, Larry Hama had a pitch for like having like a modern version of Sergeant Fury's Howling Commandos that kind of like fight terrorists or whatever, kind of like it was like a proto version of this. But like the Baroness in the Nick Fury comics, there's the Countess. So she's like,
Hooded Cobra Commander.
Hooded Cobra Commander. Now, when you'd watch the cartoon, they would kind of alternate in episodes. They would alternate between like Duke being the leader and Flint being the leader. They would like alternate those, but they would also alternate like Hooded Cobra Commander and like Silver Mask Cobra Commander, and you had your favorite. Like I had the Silver Mask Cobra Commander action figure, so I was like always happy when he shows up.
Me too.
In the cartoon, but
I had them both.
Yeah, Nick Fury fought Hydra, and they all look like they're like this except they're green, and so it's like, okay, who do they fight? They fight Cobra, So those are the influences. And Hooded Cobra Commander. Like, I remember, like, if you went in the store and bought Cobra Commander, it was the Silver Mask one, but then you could, like, send away, like, proof of purchase to get Hooded Cobra Commander.
I had Hooded Cobra Commander and, like...
Well, I mean, I think eventually he got, like, a wider release, but initially it was, like, a mail away.
I never had Baroness, though.
Yeah, I don't think I did either. Well, that was the thing, like, when they were creating, like, a storyline to go with these toys and things, they were making suggestions for the toys, and one of the suggestions was... like, okay, who do they fight? And Hasbro was like, what do you mean, who do they fight? And they're like, well, they got to fight somebody. So then, it was from the comics people that and from Larry Hama and like all the Marvel people that like Cobra gets introduced. Like, and so then they start making the toys of that. And then the same thing, I think it was like maybe Jim Shooter or somebody said like, it's all dudes. Like you gotta have a girl. Like, and so Baroness was like one of the things of like that came from the comics, and then they were like, okay, yeah, I guess we got to make a toy now. And they because I think Hasbro was like, oh well, this is a boys' toy line, and we found in our research that boys don't want to buy like a girl character; they just want to buy the boy characters. But it's like, okay, that's all well and good, but maybe have one on the shelf, just in case. Stalker with his jetpack. I think that was like the first G.I. Joe image that I like seeing the commercial for like, coming soon, the G.I. Joe cartoon or whatever, and seeing like Stalker flying around on a jetpack. So like he made the early impression. He was like the face of G.I. Joe for me before I saw it, before I saw the show.
Any toy with a jetpack.
Yeah.
I'm there.
And it's interesting because the jetpack, like any of the G.I. Joes could strap on a jetpack and fly around, but like Stalker was the one early on who was like associated with the jetpack. That was like his weapon of choice. They're talking about going in with a hydrofoil. That's another thing I learned from G.I. Joe was like what a hydrofoil is, because that was in the G.I. Joe board game too. You had like all your different, your tanks, you had your artillery. Arterial laser, I think it was either artillery laser or arterial laser. So that was like a new word to me. But then hydrofoil was a new word and a new concept.
Tom, that's so funny that like I learned words like military words from G.I. Joe. There was a character in like later G.I. Joe named Salvo.
Yeah.
And I learned and bazooka.
Well, that's an interesting point to bring up because Larry Hama and Herb Trimpe were both veterans. They were both veterans of the Vietnam War. I'm pretty sure Herb Trimpe was like a pilot in Vietnam, and like aviation, like he was in aviation was like his hobby for like the rest of his life, and he had like planes and stuff like that. And so like you're getting like that's sort of like with all the kind of fun and games and stuff that goes on in G.I. Joe comics, there is like an underlying credibility, particularly when we're talking about like the gallows humor and the sort of kind of like blunt kind of talk and blunt decision making and worldview of these characters. I think there's like an underlying credibility that's coming from like these two guys who have this experience.
Real is like a comic can feel.
Yeah. And there's like issues to come where like they also kind of like express their frustration with some of the, like, the ins and outs of it too. It's like an interesting balancing act. And then there's like a 5-panel silent sequence, and this is like a nice little preview of when eventually we're gonna get like a full silent issue. And then the silent issue kind of becomes an ongoing motif in G.I. Joe comics, and it became almost like an annual thing where like every year they'd have like a new like silent issue, but we get like a little silent sequence again based just from the look of it, kind of like based on like a silent sequence that was in Marvel, like Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. comic. Rock and Roll is flying by his motorcycle. He's like, rock and roll is here to stay. Like it was, and then
I've got that reissued Jeep on the last page.
And looking at like, there's these scenes where like the tanks are real small and stuff, and it makes me think of, and you see them moving.
The video games.
Yeah, it makes me think of like Combat for the Atari.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, it's like it's very video game. You can almost picture like where you gotta like turn the tanks and shoot. But it was like when I was working on the comic, it was kind of like I was like, oh, this is part of like G.I. Joe and what makes it work. And like I had never really done very many panels like this where like it's like all these like tiny sort of tanks and stuff. So it was kind of like the beginning of me incorporating that into my bag of tricks, just as a result of sort of studying this stuff. This is the other part with Rock and Roll that I like, where he's like, I'll play him a solo, a blast from the past called Wipeout. So that's kind of cool because he's like wiping these guys out with machine gun fire from his motorcycle and saying Wipeout, and then the rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat that's going. It's kind of like the drum solo in Wipeout. So that's a cool moment when they had this cool fake out where like they think they rescued her, but then she takes they take her wig off, and it's the Baroness in disguise. It was kind of a fake out.
I was
that's some cool stuff. That's some like Mission Impossible stuff. And then this is pretty grim. There's like kind of like a little village on the island too, which is part of like why they couldn't just bomb the place, but the Cobra had like a massacre there. They like killed, like that's pretty grim.
That is definitely.
And the reason they said like Cobra killed all those people so that they wouldn't help the G.I. Joe team. Like that's like these are the bad guys, and there are like stakes in this story. And then one of the characters is like, well, we should bury them, and it's like not part of. Another one's like not part of the mission parameters. Wrong, Breaker. We're not burying anyone, no matter how innocent they were. We've got an ambush to set. If we take time out to clean up the mess, we might as well call Cobra right now and tell them we're bugging out. This comic takes no prisoners. This panel here, again, like I would have never really drawn a panel like this in my comics before, but after seeing this, it's like, oh yeah, you can make these sort of formations of soldiers with like a lot of space in between, and
that's super
it's just
cool.
Like Snake Eyes, like we already have sort of Snake Eyes and Scarlet paired up, without necessarily them saying like, oh, you and me stick together, but they're kind of paired up, and that becomes they become that
like a
team from here on out. And yeah, like Snake Eyes is not front and center the way he's in the mix. He's there. He's off to the side. He's peripheral, but he is pulling your focus. You are kind of looking there. Scarlet gets one of her throwing stars out, and it goes in Cobra Commander's hand. Like that's something you'd see in like a canon, Revenge of the Ninja, and here it is in a Marvel comic again. Toy time.
I love this comic.
It's got like a cute little picture of Spider-Man in the corner, but
you're getting your ass kicked when you read this. I love this comic, Tom.
You get the big map. When I was doing my version, like I was working in as many of these maps as possible, and yeah, you do get to see like underneath this unassuming military base is actually a military base. Sort of like real world, peacetime military base that like you might, drive past or whatever in New Jersey or like here in Pittsburgh, and it's like, but then underneath the surface It's like, everybody's sharpening their knives and,
all the good vehicles are down
all
there.
the cool stuff is down there. It's almost like a metaphor for the 80s. Because, I mean, that's another thing, too. Like, this is coming, like, the Iranian hostage crisis. This is coming sort of like right after that, or maybe even concurrent with it. So that's kind of, I think that's playing here too, of like the going on this like small team rescue mission for a hostage kind of thing. But this is kind of emblematic of the 80s, where it's like we've been through this sort of, anti-war, 60s, 70s era, and now bubbling under the surface is like sort of Reaganism and like this,
Rambo.
Rambo, this like kind of ramping up of this like militarism that like even to this day has sort of, like we've been sort of feeling the effects of. Here's another thing. So it's got this ad. It's got this ad in here. And again, I didn't have this comic as a kid, but I did have the toys that would have these like little, inserts and catalogs and things.
Love it.
And this, to join the G.I. Joe Mobile Strike Force team, you can enlist in the G.I. Joe Mobile Strike Force and become a team member. You will receive an exciting membership kit with products and benefits that are not available anywhere else. Here's what you get when you join for 1 year. Blockbuster membership kit, a G.I. Joe dog tag, a metal dog tag.
Love it.
Personalized with your name and address on a 24-inch stainless steel chain. But here's what, like, when I was a kid, a G.I. Joe military web belt. What? I was like, so I learned, like, okay, a web belt. What is that? What's a web belt? And then it's olive drab. And I was like, oh, what's olive drab? So like learning these terms.
I had camo pants when I was a kid. I would have killed for like all this like G.I. Joe gear.
Yeah, I liked the idea that you could kind of like be part of the team. Like I remember contemplating. I just never did like I never took the plunge. Like occasionally my mom would like sign me up for the Star Wars fan club and stuff like that. But like this would have been a cool one too.
A poster.
Yeah, you get a poster and stuff, and thankfully, like whoever owned this comic before I didn't clip that coupon out of here. And then it has like a backup story called Hot Potato, and it's written by Larry Hama. It's not drawn by Herb Trimpe. It's drawn by Don Perlin, who becomes like he's in the mix as like an artist in like later issues of G.I. Joe. It's kind of a cool little mini adventure, and it fills things out nice because you had this like really nicely structured mission with like a beginning, middle, and end, and then like the building blows up and they're flying away and having their little banter. And so now we get like a little more of an intimate thing where we get to spend some time with Rock and Roll and Snake Eyes and Scarlet and get a little bit of, and they're kind of like pinned in this like foxhole. Look at all this cool stuff, and then you get these like pin-up drawings, and look, she's doing like the William Tell thing with her crossbow gun. If I miss with this, I know I can get it with the machine pistol. And then
oh my god, this is awesome.
You got these guys, and he's peeling potatoes, and yeah, this is Breaker, and like his thing in the comic was that he would be breaking his bubble gum.
You know what? That's another thing too. When I was little, like somehow I learned from like either my grandmother or somebody that like peeling potatoes is like punishment in like the military. Like
so then here's Stalker, kind of super relaxed, flying around, and you get a little bit of information about everybody. And yeah, you get inside front cover and inside back cover. You get some vehicle kind of stuff. But yeah, one more influence that I wanted to mention before we close it out was there was a comic called Mars Total Patrol by Wally Wood, and Larry Hama was Wally Wood's assistant for a while. And Wally Wood, I think he wrote and drew Mars Patrol Total War, and it's M.A.R.S. And it was kind of like this too, where it would be like these teams, and where the characters were like largely anonymous, but these like battle formations, and it was set in a modern day. It was like kind of like World War II style combat, but like set in a modern day kind of setting,
I want to read this.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Wally Wood did like maybe like one or two or like a couple of issues, and then like other people took over. But I never got my hands on it. I've like seen some of it online and stuff. But it's like I feel like that's in the DNA
of G.I. Joe.
Of G.I. Joe.
This is amazing.
Iconic cover.
I'm in the process of rereading these now.
Because I thought maybe this was a comic that you had read or had when you were a kid, because I know G.I. Joe is like one of your,
my
one of your
favorite things.
Yeah. There are certain comics, like the G.I. Joe comic sold extremely well. Like it was a blockbuster comic. I just, for whatever reason, I wasn't part of that, but yeah, it was as a kid, but it was a blockbuster comic. So we have like the #1 comics show where we talk about #1 issues, but then there's some, and I thought this would be a good one, but then there's sometimes with these comics, it's like, okay, do I want to do it as a #1 comics episode or create like a new series, like New God Sunday School or Thursday Comics, where like it's like, oh, I don't want to just read the first one. I want to read all of them. And I'm kind of like with this, I'm kind of feeling that like, okay, maybe do more G.I. Joes and work our way through all, because it is so good. It's such a fun journey to go on.
When I do all of them, when I do G.I. Jonesing.
Yeah, G.I. Jonesing. That can be a regular. So it'll start out as a #1 comics show thing, and then we'll rebrand as G.I. Jonesing.
Like, I think #2 was Snowbound, a snow-based.
Oh yeah. Well, it's like part 2 of Flash Gordon takes place on a snow planet. Part 2 of Star Wars takes place on a snow planet. Part 2 of G.I. Joe takes place on a snow. Like, it is so fun revisit, because the mythology just builds piece by piece. And then there's interesting things where it's like there's parts of the G.I. Joe mythology that come about in the comic and just stay in the comic and don't migrate into the cartoon at all, And so Quinn is one of those elements. But then you'll also see like bits of the mythology come in that do cross-pollinate with the cartoon. So there's like 2 tracks.
Excited.
Yeah, that'll be cool. So yeah, I'm Tom Scioli, author of Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics. I Am Stan, a graphic biography of the legendary Stan Lee, and Jack Kirby's Star Warriors, The Adventures of Adam Star and the Solar Legion. And I'm also the author of WITCHMAN, a new superhero comic book, which is in the middle of a Kickstarter campaign. In just 1 week, the Kickstarter was fully funded, but it's still going for another month. So if you want to get in on it, you can follow the link in the show notes below.
I'm Matt Zeoli.
And we'll see you next time for the #2 comics show, and then for issue 2, and then we'll do the #3 comics show for issue 3.
The #2 comics show. There's a stall. I'm like sticking.
Yeah, well, that's as we like expand our brand and our chat, because again,
I love the Total Recall.
Total Recall show is a show, but it's also
like sub.
Well, it's also the Total Recall. It's also the Total Recall show channel.
Yes.
So we can have other shows like this. So we could have the #2 comics show, which is not about famous issue 2s and second appearances of famous characters, but is about comics that are shitty, that should belong in the toilet and go down. So we can do #1 comic show and #2 comic show.